So welcome to the Ethics of Socially Disruptive Technologies podcast. My name is Jeroen Hopster, and today I'm joined by Emily Sullivan. Emily is an assistant professor at the Technical University of Eindhoven. She has published several papers, both single-authored and in collaboration with others, on topics such as machine learning and understanding, the wisdom of the crowds, and recommender systems for news items on social media. So, Emily, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Today we are going to discuss a paper you have co-authored with 6 others called Vulnerability in Social Epistemic Networks. Now, the analysis of this paper departs from a field of philosophy that is known as social epistemology. So to start off, can you give a sketch of what social epistemology is about?
Yeah, so social epistemology really is about how society kind of shapes how we know things. So epistemology is really about how and what we know and how we come to know. And a lot of epistemology historically has been on like individual epistemology. So what does it mean for me to have a belief, to revise the belief? When do I have knowledge? When do I get testimony from one other person? But social epistemology is really about how other people and social structures might impact how we come to know things and what kinds of things we might come to know.
Mm-hmm. And so one topic that seems particularly interesting in this social context of knowledge is our online social networks, right? Such as Facebook and Twitter. And there's been a lot of recent discussion about phenomena like filter bubbles, echo chambers, all sorts of epistemic issues that arise through the testimony on social media. So do you think that the traditional field of social epistemology, the traditional toolkit, is well suited to eliminate such issues?
Yeah, so I do think that our toolkit needs to be expanded. So that's partly what this paper, Vulnerability in Social Epistemic Networks, is about, is to propose a new type of methodology. But it's not to say that the traditional toolkit is bad, right? So traditionally in social epistemology, people are concerned about just like one person giving information to exactly one other person, right? And so this is important, and it's something that we build into our type of model. So what counts as like a testifying relationship, and that's going to be grounded in this traditional epistemology. But I do think that when we're talking about filter bubbles, echo chambers, and just the way that information is shared on social media platforms, you're going to have to look at some of these network topologies, right? So the structure of certain sharing networks to really understand what's going on, but also to see if there are different epistemic norms, right? When should I take up a certain belief that I see online, and how that might be different from taking up a belief from just your neighbor that you talk to on the street. Yeah, so I do think that looking at these kind of network structures, but also how epistemic virtues might be impacted by network structures, might be also other regarding, is going to be really important to understand those issues.
And so you think that it is the case that these kind of social epistemic networks, they have different norms than in dyadic testimony where only 2 people are involved?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so one thing is that if there's only one other person involved, you don't have the kind of like credence norms that you would have otherwise in a social setting, because there's really only one person and you're just considering, okay, how much weight should I give to what this person is saying? But if you're in a social context and you're hearing from lots of different people and they're saying different things, then all of a sudden you need to know how to weigh the different types of testimony differently. Okay, so that's just one somewhat obvious way in which other norms come into play.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the paper is called Vulnerability in Social Epistemic Networks. What is epistemic vulnerability, and what exactly constitutes such vulnerability in social epistemic networks?
Yeah, so vulnerability, just generally speaking, is just about how vulnerable we are to having false beliefs, right? So if you can't hear out of your left ear temporarily because of a cold or something, you're more epistemically vulnerable during that time, because if someone talks closer to your left ear, you might misunderstand what they're saying and then come to have false beliefs. So generally speaking, vulnerability is just about that, just like how vulnerable you are, or in a given situation, you're going to end up with false beliefs, really. In this paper, we define it formally as the maximum decrement epistemic standing by removing edges anywhere in the network, which I guess is kind of a mouthful. But really, at the end of the day, what it means is that, look, you're in a network of people, you're hearing information from all sorts of people, and they're all connected in various ways. So if you're hearing something from Jane, Jane might be connected to Bill, and so they really share information all the time. So in that sense, you're also connected to Bill, right? So you need to keep that in mind. And so the concept of vulnerability is just how dependent are we on certain information sources in the network. So if someone were to drop out of the network, so Bill disappears, for instance, does that all of a sudden mean that I'm going to now have false beliefs, right? So was I really dependent on Bill, even though I didn't really know it? Mm-hmm. So if we're looking at these type of structured typologies in a network, if we just start removing different connections, right, where does that then place us epistemically? Mm-hmm. And the fewer removals it takes to put us in a bad position, right, the more vulnerable we're going to be. Mm-hmm.
I see. So let's pick up on that, and let's imagine that that you are one of the agents in this epistemic network, and one of the things that might be beneficial to you is to monitor the structure of this network, right? So what are the specific aspects of network structure that you should pay specific attention to?
Yeah, so there are lots of things. So the first is that you need to take account of just how, like, the sheer number of sources that you're listening to. So one assumption we make is that the more sources you have, the better position you're going to be in. Mm-hmm. The other thing is to keep in mind, though, that is really intertwined with the number of sources is just how independent those sources are from each other. Right, so if we are talking about Bill and Jane again, so if Jane is just repeating everything that Bill says, then my sources really aren't independent, right? Because they're just saying the same thing. Mm-hmm. So I have two sources, but they're independent. They're not independent for each other. So you need to look for the independence of sources. So there are certain network structures that are known to be very bad, or to have the potential to put you in a very bad epistemic situation. And that's the so-called star network, where you have just a center node that's then connected to outer nodes, but those outer nodes aren't connected at all to each other. So basically what that means is one person is controlling the information that the other people have. Mm-hmm. And this is the way that certain types of, like, cults might work. So, like, cutting you off from all your other information sources. So you're really only relying on the one person It's also empirically been shown that's how it operates in like terrorist organizations, and even academic fraud has this kind of center node that then goes outwards, and those people aren't then talking to each other or confirming with each other what's going on. And so this puts you in a very epistemically vulnerable position because you're dependent right on just one source. And I mean, so in some ways you might think, well, there's nothing wrong with the structure, right? If that center node is telling you the truth all the time. So in some ways it's true that you're doing well epistemically because you're getting the truth from this one person. But the idea that we're pointing out is that, I mean, this doesn't actually make you to have a very secure position, right? Because if things change, then now you're in a really, really bad position, and things might change in a way that you're not going to be aware of. So you're really relying on the goodwill or the epistemic standing of just one person. And if you look at maybe just one newspaper, say, as just your single source for everything, well, then that's going to be in that same kind of, you're dependent on what that news source says. And we've seen in the past that even reliable news sources like the New York Times have been wrong about really important issues, right? Then, like whether or not there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And because of that, we went to war and created this whole mess of a situation, right? Even though the New York Times is supposed to be a reliable source. So if you're just focusing on one source, then it can lead to these problems.
Right. So
it's also there, just also quickly, there are a couple other things too, which is just the diversity of sources. So the diversity of viewpoint of your sources. So if you have a lot of independent sources, but they're all saying the same thing, you need to watch out for that. And then also just the general reliability of sources is important too.
And so these are all sort of properties of the networks in which you are embedded that you can monitor, right? And then in the paper you speak about monitoring and the various facets you have to pay attention to, but you also speak of adjusting and restructuring your network, and you portray these as epistemic virtues. I found that very interesting. So can you elaborate a bit on what you mean by this? What are the virtues of adjusting and restructuring your network?
Yeah, so adjusting is more about how you should change your credence level for various pieces of testimony. So adjusting isn't necessarily adjusting the network per se, but it's like you adjusting to the network that you find yourself in. So in non-extreme cases, adjusting is enough, right? So if you know, like, oh, you know, Sally, she's not as trustworthy, so whenever I hear what she says, I'm just not going to treat her. I'm going to treat it with low confidence. You can still keep her in your network, you know. And so there's virtues about making sure that you can do this well, right? There's going to be an Aristotelian mean for how to give weight to certain various pieces of testimony from people in the network. And then restructuring is would have to happen when you find yourself in a network that is quite bad, that you need to restructure. So this could be by cutting people off, right? So I'm not listening to you anymore at all. You're now not in my network. Or this might be by adding people. So you realize that you don't have a good diversity of viewpoint in your sources, so then you're going to go seek out additional people who have different viewpoints than you and include them in your epistemic network. So, I mean, in another paper that I wrote with Mark Alfano, Vectors of Epistemic Insecurity, we discuss these virtues in more detail. We do say that, you know, cutting people off might not really necessarily be a socially epistemic virtuous action. And so even though it might help you individually, there are other virtues, like these other regarding virtues, that Fricker and Caldwell talk about. So virtues that help other people. And so there might be some reasons why you should keep listening to people, even if you know it's just all fake news, in order for you to then help other people about what they say and try to talk to them about maybe the conspiracy theories that they're hearing about, which you wouldn't be able to do, right, if you cut yourself off from those sources altogether.
So I'm interested. I mean, clearly this analysis holds sway for a lot of epistemic practices we engage in real life, right? I mean, we're embedded in these networks all the time. And also in your paper, actually, you analyze a debate about vaccine safety that has taken place on Twitter. You do apply your analytical framework very much to real empirical case studies. So I would be interested to hear, what did you find out about epistemic vulnerability on Twitter, perhaps specifically in the paper, or more generally, how does your proposal latch on to actual epistemic practices?
Yeah, so I mean, perhaps unsurprising, the stuff on vaccine safety on Twitter is very polarizing. So you get clear clusters of people who are anti-vax, people who are pro-vaccine, and there's very little overlap in between. There are also just like a couple key players in the anti-vax. So we did work looking at like a 1 month period, I think either 2016 or 2017, and then we looked at that same month a year later. And we saw that the people who were most active in the pro-vaccine community weren't the same people, but in the anti-vax community, they were the same people. So it was the same person a year later that had the most influence over the anti-vax network. So that's interesting, because then it does seem like the people who are in the anti-vax community, I mean, it's really their main topic, right, that you don't really see them deviating from, where the pro-vaccine people maybe just come and go, right? Maybe it's just one issue among others that they're interested in. So that's one thing that, frankly, is a little surprising, right? So in this paper, we found that like how the people are doing epistemically is quite bad in this discussion. So we narrowed it down to just like 185 nodes or 185 accounts as like the core network of where most of the communication was happening. And only 15% had what we considered a high epistemic position. And that is by accounting for things like number of sources, independence of sources, the diversity of the viewpoints they're listening to. Mm-hmm. So only 15% had this high epistemic position, but 34% had a really dangerously low epistemic position. So we're only listening to one or two sources that were not independent at all from each other. Mm-hmm. So this does show us that there is extreme vulnerability, epistemic vulnerability on Twitter, if twice as many of the people in the network were in a very dangerously low epistemic position. Mm-hmm. So then we're in a good position. Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, so if we become aware of this, I mean, what would be a way to help this, to help improve matters, right? So you're speaking about virtue. So perhaps we might become aware as agents in a network of what network virtues are, and then we might sort of improve our engagements in these networks. But perhaps that's also too high an aim, because maybe it's very difficult to grasp this quite abstract concepts for all agents. I mean, how do you see that? What is the way forward, in a way, departing from your analysis?
Yeah, I mean, it's well. So one thing we do need to say is that what we looked at were like retweet networks, right? So it could be that the people on Twitter were reading posts from other people. So we're actually drawing from other sources, but didn't find those sources important enough to retweet, right? So there's that aspect to it. So that's just a limitation of the research. But yeah, I mean, in terms of what to do, I mean, yeah, it's extremely difficult to know, or maybe even impossible for you to know the structure of your epistemic network on Twitter, right? Because if you're following so many people and those people are following so many people, I mean, it can't be done. I mean, one suggestion would be that if Twitter, Facebook were to provide you a kind of snapshot of your network and the connections, it might make it very illuminating to you where your weak spots are or how much your network is really interconnected in ways that you didn't realize. So that might be one way to just let people know what their network looks like. And there's research on how to display, complex information in a way that people find understandable, right? So that's a research project that you could do. I mean, another thing is and one thing that we talk about, I think, in some papers, but I think we need to be really careful here, is that you could help, or Twitter could design their platform to promote epistemic values over the values that they currently promote, which is just engagement, right? And so then that would mean amplifying some voices over other voices. Mm-hmm. But I think we need to be careful here how much power we give to these tech companies. I mean, I think that just even knowing about this problem can be beneficial for people to just think about, like what is the pattern of information sharing? Maybe I shouldn't just, even if everyone I know is tweeting the same thing, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true, right? Because of these certain vulnerabilities in the network. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's always a hard question about how to get people to be epistemically virtuous, right? I know I don't know the answers to that, but I think awareness, is one of the first steps for sure.
Cool. I mean, these are many interesting leads to follow up upon. So to end this interview, I'd like to ask you a question about your future research. In 2020, you've been awarded the prestigious VENI grant by the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research. And can you give us a preview of the research you'll be conducting with your VENI? And specifically, maybe perhaps you can explain how this relates to the ethics of socially disruptive technologies?
Yeah, sure. So, well, in many ways, the VENI grant is a different topic, but there are some overlaps. So, like one thing I just mentioned is one thing that Twitter could do is provide some kind of snapshot to help you understand your network, right? And that there's research in, well, how do we explain something like that? So the VENI project is about explainability of AI systems, and in particular machine learning systems. So how much can we really, what are the norms of explanation of these systems that they should follow? So what should be in the explanation? Can we actually get such explanations given how opaque machine learning systems are? And to what extent does opaqueness impact the understanding that we can get from these systems? So that's the research there. It's definitely socially disruptive to be using these technologies because they're entering in ways, every sector of our society, people are using these systems. So Twitter is using them to decide who to amplify and who not to amplify. They're doing it from what we know based off of engagement, but they could be doing it for all sorts of other reasons too, because it's all, behind closed doors. And even in the COVID epidemic, people have been talking about using machine learning systems to make decisions about who should get treatment at the hospital and who shouldn't when there are very few beds left at the hospital. Right, so then we're using these systems to make important decisions, that impact us, right? We need to know, well, why are they making the decisions that they're doing? And we need to know, depending on the domain that they're being used in, there are certain things we want to know more than others, right? So there's going to be certain norms of what these explanations need to tell us, depending on the domain, or so that's what I'm going to be looking at in this project.
Well, it sounds like a very fascinating research project as well. So Emily Sullivan, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been fun.